Hello, my name is Eefke Smit. I'm the Director for Standards and Technology of STM, and we'll bridge that little bit from here to lunch, and we'll do it I hope, in an engaging way so that you don't start to think about lunch, but instead you'll be thinking, we hope, about research data. I thoroughly enjoyed the session that was just here before us because they told us how to innovate, what to do, how to organize innovation. We'll be talking here about a very concrete innovation, and that is research data, because research data is really changing the landscape now of publishing and of open science. And I'm also very happy that I can announce here the fact that within STM we find research data now so important that we will be dedicating 2020 as the STM Research Data Year. And on your chairs you found a little leaflet, probably now somewhere on the floor or, or wherever, but we'll also be talking about this leaflet because there will be a flurry of activity around research data in 2020, and you can see this panel as sort of a soft launch of that. And the panel consists of people from publishing organizations with a lot of experience in research data. We have Baynes of Springer Nature, responsible for their research data initiatives and new product and new service development. We have Iain Hrynaszkiewicz. I hope Iain, I pronounce it correctly. He usually says that it's also okay if we say Iain H. So this is the famous Iain H. Of PLoS, responsible for open science initiatives there. And we have Wouter Haak from Elsevier, who does the research data activities there, and especially Data Mendeley. And we had a special purpose for inviting these people here because they are already doing a lot for their authors and their editors to make sure that they can share, link, and cite data. Those are the three things we want you to remember, especially at the end of the 2020 research year, that it's about share, link, and cite. So, to get to the panel, each of our panel members also has one slide. I'm starting with Grace, because Grace, can you explain to us why is research data so important?
Absolutely. Thank you, Eefke, and hello, everybody. I'm going to just briefly speak about why research data really matters and also start to introduce you to why you, the publishers of research articles and books, matter too. So why does research data matter? It matters because it matters to research. We talk a lot about concerns about reproducibility, about research integrity. Researchers are really struggling not only with reproducing other people's work, but with reproducing their own. And often that's because they're not managing their data in ways that enable them to go back to it and understand, let alone explain it to somebody else. Research data matters to researchers themselves in terms of their productivity, in terms of citation impacts, and Iain's going to tell you a little bit more about a recent study that really demonstrates this over a large range of articles. It matters to the research community because there are real costs at stake. So a recent study by PricewaterhouseCoopers for the European Commission estimated that not managing data well is currently costing the EU 10 billion euros a year. And that's through duplication of effort, primarily. And it matters to society, not just for the reasons that we've been talking about this morning, about facts and about evidence-based approaches, but also unlocking research data and powering it with the kind of innovative technology we heard about in the last session has the ability to really create jobs, create benefit for our economy. So with all of those benefits to the research community, to researchers, and to society, what can we as publishers do, and do we have a role to play? I would say absolutely yes, and Springer Nature last year published a study actually earlier this year that brought together the views of 11,000 researchers that, over surveys we've done over several years, and distilled that down into 5 essential factors for making data management and sharing common practice. And I'm going to just touch on 2 that are particularly relevant and where we can all take action today. So 1 is clear policy. Researchers are confused about what is expected of them. It's a changing landscape, but they very much listen to and are influenced by researcher policy. And in the State of Open Data 2019 survey, which Digital Science and Figshare will publish next week, we found that actually publisher requirement is moving up to be even more important than in previous years. And as you're going to hear in our discussion, it doesn't have to be complicated and you don't have to start from scratch to have clear policy. And the other aspect is better credit. Credit for good practice is a real motivator for researchers in sharing research data. And when we've asked them what motivates you and what would you consider credits, the number 1 answer is citations to their work. And by enabling that and by marking them up well, which every publisher can move to do, we can really make a difference.
Excellent, thank you. My next question is for Iain. How can journals, how can they make more clear what they do in terms of research data, what they can offer to authors who want to share research data? I think this should be this slide.
Yeah, so I'm going to get down into the practical, meaningful, but achievable things that publishers can do. And Grace has already referred to some of the things we commonly hear when we get into discussions about open science, about reproducibility, the wasted funding of research, the unreliable articles that are potentially being published. And there's lots of innovative technical solutions to these problems. We've probably all had conversations about or seen examples of runnable code, of interactive figures, and these are all really exciting, but they actually only at the moment are capable of being deployed to a small fraction of the content that we publish. If we really want to enable this reproducible research, which when it's actually even possible is more relevant for computational work, but if we really want to achieve that, then firstly we need to achieve transparency. And transparency is what we can reasonably ask for and in some cases demand. But if we want to achieve transparency, we need a much lower technology solution, which often means simply starting with a policy. So setting expectations of how we want researchers and other stakeholders to behave. And the good news is that in the last 3 years or so in particular, most of the large publishers have begun to introduce research data policies of some kind. For the most part, these policies are making data sharing optional, but with more stringent policies in certain communities. But of course, that's progress, and we have to start somewhere. And I think it's also very important that we make the expectations or the requirements that we place on researchers when they publish with us clear and consistent, but also being honest about when things are optional and when things are actually mandatory. And if you are making something mandatory, that you have procedures in place to make sure that that experience is consistent for all authors. So even more practical, and onto my slide, an important tool for introducing a consistent, clear data sharing policy is something called a data availability statement. It's a bit like an acknowledgement section for data, if you're not familiar with them. So PLoS, where I work, we led the way with a very strong data sharing policy, and a key component of that was requiring all authors to provide a data availability statement. And we've now published more than 122,000 papers at last count that have one of these statements in them, which means we can do some quite interesting analyses of behavior as a result of having that policy. Another early adopter of this kind of policy was BMC, Biomed Central. So this is included in the figure here. So they introduced a policy in 2015 of requiring all papers to include one of these statements. But actually, before that, in 2012, they had an optional policy to provide these statements. And you can see the very light-colored bars in the BMC side of the chart that when you encourage something, you do change behavior, but to about 5% of the researchers that did provide one of those statements. But if we're going to require new content, a new section in papers, that's not free. There are going to be costs associated with doing that, particularly if you're publishing thousands of articles. Whether the authors, it's going to take them a bit more time. Editors, editorial office staff, etc. There is a cost associated with that. But to paraphrase Jean-Claude Bergelmann at the European Commission, we should really see that as an investment rather than a cost, because there's growing recognition both from funders, from editorial groups like the ICMJE, and from societies as well, that this simple tool, the data availability statement, is a meaningful and achievable improvement that we can all seek to achieve. And for papers that follow good practice, so if they share their data in a repository and then in their data availability statement, they include a link to that data in the repository, there's reasonable evidence that you may receive more citations, there may be more reuse of that work by properly linking articles and data. Demonstrated in one study, which is available as a preprint, including the peer-reviewed version that's just come out, of which I'm a co-author. So we analysed 500,000 papers at PLoS and BMC and found that on average, the papers that linked to data from the data availability statement had on average 25% increase in citations. So I think taken together with the fact that we're trying to promote more reliable, reusable research along with this really important incentive, then I think that's a really good return on any investment.
Thank you, Iain. Now over to Wouter, because we're also talking not just about sharing research data, but also linking them to publications, right? Can you tell us a bit more about it? I'll get your slide up.
Thank you. I can actually make it 3 times.
Okay, then you get it all.
There you go.
5, 6, 7
what
times.
What I want to talk about is actually simple things. I was a bit daunted this morning, like we're in the deep, dark abyss, and the only way out of that is innovation, and innovation has to be groundbreaking. And I'm actually really happy to be in a panel where we do simple steps that are quite achievable and actually have massive impact. So what you see on these slides are actually, the blue line is the world growth of article outputs, and we all know that it's growing nicely at 5% a year. The red line is on a much smaller scale, but it's actually articles that link to research data. And as Iain just said, those articles get 25% more citations. We've done the same analysis that you just mentioned, actually for our articles as well, and actually other articles as well. We came to the same conclusion. Data sharing helps. It's the honeypot that other researchers come to. And what you can see is 2 inflection points. In the red line, you see that kind of worldwide research data sharing behavior started changing around 2014. And all of you did that good work. In Elsevier, we took a little bit of time to catch up. You see, starting January 2018, you see this inflection point. Lots and lots of researchers are sharing their data, up to more than 20%. And what we're doing is we're not hiding this in the dark abyss of supplemental data. Because if you add it as a kind of appendix to the article, it's not going to be found. What researchers now do is they store it in all kinds of repositories, and they have been doing so for a long time already. Domain repositories, subject repositories, and generalist repositories are great places to make data usable and findable. But what you need to do is link it. And that is super simple. It starts with a data availability statement, which is nothing more than questions like, where did you put your data? And in case, and actually we're more soft than PLoS or BMC, we don't always mandate data sharing, but we do it optional. But we do ask, where did you store your data? And in case you did not share your data, please explain why you didn't share it, and then that statement is added. And you see the behavioral change, where massive amounts of researchers start sharing their data more and more, and we link it. And the point that I want to make, and maybe click 1 or 2 more times to get to the bottom of the slide, this is really important.
Oh, more.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
submit your data links to Crossref. Crossref will pick it up, massage it, process it, and send it through to the Scholix framework, which then sends it out to the rest of the world. And that's where magic happens. That's where the findability happens. So for you, this is actually super simple. All of you are working with Crossref already. You need to send through one more or two more links, which you capture through this submission process. Your submission process providers, they're here in the room, they can already do this. They already provide services for this. So it's actually super simple. Innovation does not have to be hard.
That's so super simple, and to stick to the terminology of the previous panel, probably not completely disruptive, but extremely transformative. And to keep things simple, we would like to do a little survey here with all of you in the room. And I have some questions for you, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands on a few questions. We would like to know how many of you have policies in place for research data in some kind, in any kind. Please put up hands. Oh, that's encouraging. But I still see a lot of hands not shown. Now, how many of you, and now I'm going to ask you to stand up, not just hands up, but how many of you have standardized policies? So policies that follow recommendations, for example, from the Center of Open Science or from the Research Data Alliance, so that authors find similar policies across different publishers. Who can stand up? Oh, so
Stand
much
up,
work
Stephen.
to do. Ah, was that you, David? Yes, very good. OUP has a standardized policy, very good. So this maybe also indicates what we like to achieve as STM in the coming year, because right now there's a steep increase, as you saw in all the graphs, for authors who want to share research data. But it's very complicated and confusing for them if every publisher does something different. So the main thing that we think we can contribute as STM, make sure that there's more standardization and a more common approach, more conventions in how to do that, so that authors can immediately see, oh, is it that simple? Because it is as simple as Wouter has said, as Iain has explained, and it is as important as Grace was underlining. So I'm going to do a bit more of the survey, also to keep you awake before lunch, of course, because this was about policies. How many of you have linking arrangements for data and research articles? Hands up. Very good, but not enough. But of course, that will be different when we're here again in Frankfurt next year. How many of you have instructions on data citation? Okay, similar amount. Now, of course, the questions where we hope to see more hands. How many of you would like to introduce more policies on research data? Okay. And why do so many of you not want it? And how many would like to get better explained how to link data and publications, if it's really that simple? Okay, that's very good. And to have more standardized data citation rules? Okay, very good. You will be our first candidates for our first free workshop on research data. We'll be having several of them all around the world, so we'll be coming to you if you don't come to us. The first is on this leaflet on December the 2nd, especially for STM members. It has a link on the back where you can register. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the panel and talk a bit more about the how-to. And my first question is for whoever wants to take it, how difficult is it to introduce those data availability statements that Iain mentioned?
So it depends on how it's done. The publishers that have introduced standardized policies often have a policy type which makes something optional, in which case it is really quite simple, other than recognizing, I suppose, that there is going to be a new type of content included in papers, and then things scale from there depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve. I think some of the data we've presented demonstrates that if you invest a bit more in doing it in rigorous ways, and then you do see more of the benefit. A few other data points that I'm aware of, or one in particular. It does take some time for the editors, and if I was part of a study where we tried to see how much time it would take if we were going to both require the statements, but then get the editors to look at them, to look at the contents, because there's a difference between asking for the statement and then actually checking what it says. And when you do the latter, around about 8 to 10 minutes a paper from around 300 papers at some journals with professional editors, I would imagine that you can achieve much greater efficiencies of scale. So a small cost, but a significant one. Also, it's really worth considering what you expect and what you accept as behaviour. So, for example, again, to share another data point. So at PLoS, we have a very well-established policy, but in 2019, 26% of papers we published have a link in a repository. So actually still the most common, and it's acceptable often, because we don't make it that easy to do something else often, and this is a problem I think we all have, is the most common statement is that the data are in the supplementary information files, which lots of publishers then put in Figshare, or other repositories are available. But that's still a very common behaviour. So the level of rigour and what you expect, and whether or not the community resources are there, are all important considerations. But I think where you see, I guess, the preferred behaviour is where there is a real need to share in a particular way, and usually that means having a community-focused resource.
Okay. Grace, I understand you had a rollout program within Springer Nature, right? How did that go?
Well, so actually, amazingly, we're still working on it, but we do have over 2,000 journals, and many of which we publish on behalf of others. And I think, Iain's the research that Iain's mentioning is drawn on our experience at rolling out those policies at Springer Nature. And in general, what we found is, yes, it does take a little bit of effort. It does take a bit of coordination. It takes good communication. But actually, it's entirely achievable. And it's very little system changes, very little integration. If you do it well, you introduce some very scalable checks and some basic support for researchers in terms of resources, all of which there are shared resources available, which as part of STM's year of data, we will be pointing you to, so you don't need to start from scratch. So it's effort, but it is achievable.
Good. And any experience from Elsevier, Wouter?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I must say, when we first tried this with a handful of journals, a couple of hundred journals, 4 years ago, it was quite difficult. It was actually, the systems weren't in place yet, the communities weren't familiar with it yet. Actually, since 2018, we've rolled it out to about 1,800 journals. And that was actually quite easy. I mean, there have been massive community initiatives, like, for example, COPDES, C-O-P-D-E-S-S, that is a domain-specific initiative that kind of encouraged all those journals to adopt data linking, data availability statements. The funders were involved. And because of that, there's so much noise. There's so much noise now also about fair data that actually we found that since technology is in place with Crossref, since the communities are pushing for it themselves, and since I think also researchers are now more used to this notion, it's pretty easy. Now, why not all 2,500 journals? So we still have like 700 journals to go. Well, there are some communities that feel entirely uncomfortable with standardization. They feel entirely uncomfortable with sharing. That's okay, right? So we take them maybe in the next 10 years. It's not a sacred must-do. It's something where we help and enable. And I would say the majority of the communities want this, but not all have to.
I think, just to add to that, I think one of the things that's become particularly clear to us at Springer Nature recently and has already come up in our discussions about this STM initiative, is that a lot of the principles and practices around research data and data management and sharing have come out of STM subject areas, and that we clearly still have some work to do to make sure that we really have the right solutions for humanities and social sciences, and that's something that we're really hoping that working together, STM publishers can really work on.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I would like to see, are there any questions in the room to the panel? People who are wondering how to do this. Yeah, there's a question there in the back.
Eric Hall, Copyright Clearance Center. I'm just curious in your research if you've looked at how the change in data availability standards has impacted the peer review process, whether it's lengthened it or shortened it, or if it's had any impact at all.
Good question. Who in the panel would like to jump into this?
I can comment a little bit. This isn't really from research evidence, a bit more anecdotal experience. Certainly, if you want peer reviewers to engage with your data policy, or indeed even to engage with the data supporting articles, you have to make it easy for them. Previously, when I was working with Scientific Data Journal, they put the link to the data on page 1 of the reviewer PDF, and lo and behold, if you do that, then people access the data. But so you have to make it possible, and I think that's all I can add.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably say that I wouldn't. My recommendation would be not to make your peer reviewers responsible for making sure that someone's complying with your policies on data availability, and I think that's something that the journal should be doing, publishers should be doing.
Yeah, data peer review is an area that we're not touching upon yet, but we have it as an investigation within STM because we want to find out what the different levels of peer review could be for research data, whether it's just checking that data are there, checking that data can be opened, checking that data can be reused, or even checking whether the data really confirms the statements in the article.
That's the most important.
And all those levels require different levels of peer review. Some journals are experimenting in it already, but definitely not across the board. So we make simple steps first, let's say, crawl before we can walk. And the baby steps here is just to make sure that the research data are there. And then what happens with the research data, maybe we can announce that next year or the year thereafter or whatever. I see another question, Anthony.
I add one more thing to this.
Please.
Because actually I think the peer review process, as most of you know, is usually double blind, and it is pretty awkward for an author to pre-share the data publicly before the article has been published. So to really go further and to actually involve your peer reviewers in depth, you might want to have a blank data page where it's actually synchronized with the article submission, which goes a lot further than what we're proposing here. Now, to be honest, we have actually implemented that. So Mendeley Data has that, and we're doing that. So our peer reviewers are actually, they don't know, like the authors are not mentioned on the data set when it's part of the peer review process. So it's a pure, nice double-blind process. Now, that is not what we're proposing here, and it's also not what you need. What you can do is start simple and do the linking and get the discussion going with your editors and your editorial boards. Once you have this simple step in place, then you may also go the next level, which is synchronize those things in double-blind peer review, anonymize the authors and all that. That is possible, but that's just one extra step you need to do. I would start simple.
Yeah.
It can be a source of conflict. So I've been involved in conversations with editors where they explicitly do not want to trouble peer reviewers with review of the data. At PLoS, we have an explicit question in the peer reviewer form about compliance with the data availability policy, but that can be a big change for some journals.
Anthony.
It was more sharing something. We've been working on early career researchers now for 4 years, 3 years of interviewing in a different sample in the last year of a survey. And I can tell you that the early career researchers have been talking to are very confused about data. And when you ask them what they're doing with it, the biggest number who are doing anything at all serious are putting it into supplementary material.
Oh.
They are doing that.
It's the worst
what they
option.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just say that we've done similar research, as have others, and at every career stage, researchers are confused. They're confused about whether they should share, where to share, how to share. They are willing to do it, and if it's a requirement for publishing in your journal to do it in some way, they are much more likely to do it. But they do definitely need help and advice, and that's something that we can readily provide without reinventing the wheel to our authors.
I just wanted to comment on supplementary material because I hear it said a lot and we all say, yes, it's terrible, stuff should happen, we should get rid of it, but then we don't make it possible really to do anything different. So it shouldn't really be a surprise at the moment that we have 50, 60 files uploaded as supplementary material, which can take hours in some cases. I was speaking to a researcher recently. So I think that's where some technology really can help make things easier if we really want to enable better behaviours.
I see there's one more question there, please, Richard.
Yeah, good morning. Richard Wynn from Rescognito. One of the underlying assumptions is that researchers are motivated by more citations. I think a couple of you touched on that. And I wonder whether citations are the best vehicle for incenting researchers with respects to data. Because if 5 authors on one manuscript cite another manuscript with another 5 authors, that's 25 possible recognitions, different channels of recognition. And then you're not really citing them specifically for the data itself. And I think especially early career researchers want to be recognized for the work that they did on the data for data curation or software development. So I'm wondering if any of you are looking at more direct ways of incentivizing and recognizing those contributions around data.
Very good question.
Maybe I can talk to that. So I don't think the one precludes the other, and I think that's also what you're proposing. I think you're absolutely right. We'd like to recognize researchers more broadly than citations, and that's a movement that's happening everywhere. I mean, you see the whole alternative metrics movement, the basket of metrics movement to, particularly also in the humanities and social sciences, better recognize researchers for the contribution, and I think that's a really good movement. So it goes without saying that we're counting usage of data, we're then attributing that back to the data producers and curators, and we're trying to give credit to that. To be honest, I mean, this is a slow changing system. So the funding bodies are slowly changing as well. And as long as the funding bodies are not changing their way to recognize good research and good contributions, it's very hard to change the whole system at the same time. Now, I don't want to point a finger at the funding bodies because they're innovating as much as we are. So there are several funding bodies that are changing the way they recognize contributions, and data sets is one of them. So I think this is not saying that we should pick one or another metric. The nice thing about citations is most people recognize it, it's easier to communicate, and I think also early career researchers recognize it for its value, and we should add.
Can I add a little bit to that just before we close? Richard, I think it's a really good point, and I agree with you. So when you ask researchers what motivates them to share their research data, the number one answer is always impact and visibility of my research and wanting to increase it, and that's what they care most about. Increased citations are one way of evidencing that it does have an impact. Actually, I'm much more interested in making experimental research data a first-class research object that somebody will be proud to put on their CV, that will be considered for funding applications and for promotions. But that's a long road, and there are immediate steps that we can take to encourage better practice today. So I think this is one of it, and it's part of the story.
Excellent. I think there's another question there.
Philip DiVietro, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. My question is, are there any concerns that pirate sites such as Sci-Hub will begin linking to this data? And I asked the question in the context of, my understanding is that Crossref deems itself neutral, and that Sci-Hub has began pulling in data from Crossref to clean up their database. Any comments regarding that?
I think we have somebody from Crossref in the room. Jeff, is that you there in the back? Darrell? Could you get the mic to Jeff? Jeff, please clarify.
Yes, so I'm Jeffrey Builder, Director of Technology and Research at Crossref, and we've been asked to look for evidence of Sci-Hub activity in Crossref, and we've used a number of techniques, and we're happy to try others, but so far we've seen no evidence of that. And I'm happy to talk to you about details if you're interested.
Okay.
Very simply, I feel it would be a nice problem to have because it proves that it's valuable if Sci-Hub are choosing to use it.
Yeah. Well, Crossref, as you heard from Wouter, in the whole linking thing, Crossref will also be very central for this initiative. Jerry, I see you have a question?
Hi, Jerry Grenier, IEEE. I'd like to follow on Richard's comment on the recognition and the discussion on recognition in general. There is a NISO standards committee now working on a set of reproducibility open data badges. We will have a draft paper by the December Innovations meeting in London, and we'll be doing a presentation on that. So I would invite you all to pitch to sign up for the innovation seminar on December
The 3rd, Tuesday, December the 3rd. Yes, exactly.
But it's
thank you, Jerry.
We feel that one of the missions of the reproducibility badging committee or effort is that the badges can serve as a currency that might tie into general citations, and we would further like to develop a registry of the badges, so they're not simply an image that editors assign to a journal article, but must be registered with metadata accompanying them. So more on that in December.
Can I add to that? Because I think the common theme of this panel is that we'd like to be here next year and look back at all of you and actually have achieved something.
Yeah.
And the achievement is that...
Together with you.
Together with you. As a publishing industry, I think we frequently get blamed for that everybody does it their own way. And we don't help the researchers in a simple, straightforward way. And I think, to be honest, some of that criticism is correct. Each of us does it their own way. So I like these standardized initiatives. And what I like about the Data Availability Statement initiative, it's standardized. It's been accepted, and we can all do it.
Yeah.
The same goes for data linking. It follows the Scholix data linking schema. It's a standard. It's been accepted. The community has embraced it. And I think if we can look at each other next year and we say, we have done it. All of us have achieved this. And we can go back to the researcher community and say, look what we've done with you and for you as publishers in a standardized way. I think we can actually say, we've innovated. And maybe the badges is then the next wave of the next standardization. We can build upon that. That is what iteration is. I think if I listen to the previous panel, I get a little bit daunted because innovation sounds like a big thing. For me, innovation is what are you going to do in the next 2 weeks?
Yeah, I think I'm very interested and supportive of badges and other efforts like that. So, and I think we should be pushing on all of these directions, but I also agree, let's do concrete steps forward as well. But I think one of my big takeaways and big encouragements from the last previous panel, and Stephen's going to laugh at me now because my favourite topic, which is being focused on our customers and being focused on where they are and what they need and what will really deliver for their jobs to be done. And I think we need to take that approach with researchers around research data, and we should be idealistic and we should push things forward, but we should also really understand what's going to move the needle for them today and do that.
I think this is a perfect start of the round off. And with that, I want to show the last slide. I would like to mention to you again, we'll be doing the first research data workshop for STM members on the 2nd of December. On the 3rd of December, we have our innovation seminar, also with all kind of real-life cases on what you can do with research data and how many other innovations can build on that. So please come there too. And we have also a panel on the badging initiative that Jerry just mentioned. So come there because you'll hear the really hands-on stuff about it. And I would also like to ask you, stay tuned throughout that year of 2020, because we'll have workshops, we'll have online webinars, and we'll also give you hands-on support if you want that. We'll have experienced publishers available for you to explain to your staff in-house at the desks how to actually do it. And it is simple. And it is something that the world expects from us, and it's something where we can show that we work on open science, on reproducibility, and everything that the research world wants. So, again, the 3 keywords: share, link, and cite research data. That was it. And many thanks to the panel who wanted to explain it so clearly.